The night was heavy with silence, the kind that wraps around the air like a suffocating shroud. Eleanor Williams clutched her newborn close to her chest as she ran through the narrow streets of her neighborhood. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, her arms trembling from exhaustion and fear. The moon cast pale beams through the cracks in the dense leafless trees above, creating jagged shadows on the cracked pavement beneath her feet. Behind her, distant footsteps echoed a slow, deliberate rhythm. Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She knew they were coming for her. They always came in the dark, cloaked in the guise of authority, their faces masks of cold resolve. Her baby stirred, a faint whimper escaping his tiny lips. She pressed her lips to his forehead, murmuring a soft "shh," though her voice quivered with barely suppressed panic. The little one had no way of knowing the danger that lurked in the shadows, no way of understanding why his mother was running. The alleyway opened into a narrow courtyard littered with forgotten trash and overgrown weeds. Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting from one potential hiding spot to another. To her left, the door of an old shed stood ajar. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, her worn shoes slipping against the damp ground. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and decay. She crouched in the corner, her back pressed against the splintered wooden wall, cradling her child as though her sheer will could shield him from what was to come. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Her body tensed as the door creaked open, the sound of daggers slicing through the stillness. She could see the outline of a figure, a shadowed silhouette standing in the doorway, unmoving, imposing. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, no." What happened next was a blur. The sharp cry of the baby, Eleanor's desperate scream, and the slam of the door as the light was swallowed whole. The silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, final. And then there was nothing. The morning was still, the kind of eerie quiet that only old cemeteries seemed to hold. Emma adjusted her scarf against the crisp chill of the air as she made her way through the wrought iron gates of St. Augustine Cemetery. The place had been abandoned for years, its paths overrun with weeds, and the tombstones were weathered into near obscurity. She had volunteered to survey the site for a local historical preservation project, armed with nothing more than a notebook, a pen, and a sense of curiosity. There was something about places like this, soaked in stories, lives forgotten, that drew her in. Emma's boots crunched softly over the gravel path as she paused to study a particularly ornate headstone. Her fingers brushed the engraved name, long faded by time, when something caught her eye further down the row, a small patch of earth, freshly disturbed. The site was out of place amidst the overgrown stillness of the cemetery. She approached cautiously, her pulse quickening with each step. The grave was marked with a modest stone, its edges softened by moss. The name was clear enough, Eleanor Williams, with a date of death 30 years prior. But it wasn't the headstone that drew Emma's breath short. It was what rested on top of it, a blanket. It was a simple thing, faded but carefully folded. Emma frowned, hesitating for a moment before reaching out. As she unfolded the fabric, her fingers stilled. A baby. Her heart lurched. The tiny infant was swaddled tightly, its face serene and impossibly small. Emma dropped to her knees, her mind racing. The child couldn't have been more than a few days old, its skin warm beneath her trembling hand. "Who would?" she whispered, the words breaking against the lump in her throat. She looked around, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but the cemetery was as silent as ever. The wind stirred gently, rustling the bare branches overhead. Emma carefully cradled the baby in her arms. It didn't cry, didn't fuss, as though it too was suspended in the surreal stillness of the moment. Her gaze fell back to the headstone. 30 years. Eleanor Williams had been dead for 30 years. The questions came in an unrelenting rush. Who had left the baby here? Why this grave? And, more hauntingly, what kind of desperation or pain would drive someone to leave a newborn in a place like this? Emma swallowed hard, holding the child closer. She didn't have the answers, not yet. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Emma drove in silence, the baby resting quietly in the carrier strapped beside her. The stillness inside the car felt heavy, mirroring the questions that churned in her mind. She hadn't told the authorities much when she called, just enough to make them take her seriously, or so she thought. The police station was dimly lit, the kind of place where the walls seemed to absorb more truths than they revealed. Emma sat stiffly in a plastic chair, cradling the baby as a bored-looking officer finally approached. "So," he began, glancing at the bundled child. "You're saying you found a baby on a grave?" "Yes," Emma said, her voice firm. "On a grave in St. Augustine Cemetery. The baby is healthy, but someone left him there intentionally. That's not normal." The officer raised an eyebrow, jotting down a few notes. "And the grave? Did you recognize the name?" Emma hesitated. "Eleanor Williams. She's been dead for 30 years. That got his attention briefly. He frowned, tapped his pen against the clipboard, then shrugged. "Could be some kind of sick prank. We'll look into it." "Look into it?" Emma's voice rose despite herself. "This isn't a prank. There's a child involved. Don't you think that deserves more than a casual glance?" The officer's face hardened. "Ma'am, we'll do what we can, but this isn't exactly the kind of case that takes priority." Emma's frustration simmered as he walked away. She clutched the baby closer, her resolve hardening. If they wouldn't take this seriously, she would. That night, Emma sat at her desk, the baby asleep in a borrowed bassinet nearby. Her laptop glowed softly in the dark as she typed Eleanor Williams into the search bar. A few scattered articles popped up, mostly obituaries and insignificant mentions in local archives. Eleanor had been a young mother in the late 1980s, part of a close-knit black community in town. The obituary mentioned her sudden and tragic death, but gave no details. There was no mention of a child. Digging further, Emma pulled up records from St. Augustine Cemetery. Eleanor's name was there, but inconsistencies leapt out at her. No documented cause of death, and her burial date didn't match the one listed on her death certificate. "What happened to you, Eleanor?" Emma whispered, staring at the screen. The baby stirred, a soft whimper breaking the silence. Emma reached over, gently rubbing their back until they settled. She felt a pang of protectiveness, not just for the baby, but for Eleanor too. Somewhere, the two stories connected. She was certain of it. The following day, Emma revisited the cemetery. This time, she took her camera and a notepad, determined to document everything she might have missed. She traced her steps back to Eleanor's grave, her breath visible in the cold morning air. The site looked undisturbed, just as it had the day before. But as she knelt beside the headstone, Emma noticed something faintly scratched into the moss-covered surface. She brushed the growth away with her glove, revealing a set of initials. D.W. Her pulse quickened. A clue, perhaps? Someone connected to Eleanor or to the child. Taking a picture of the inscription, Emma promised herself she'd find out. Whoever D.W. was, they might hold the key to this mystery. And if no one else cared enough to pursue it, Emma would. Back at home, Emma set the baby down in the bassinet, their tiny breaths steady and rhythmic. She powered up her laptop again, staring at the image of Eleanor's headstone with the initials D.W. faintly etched into the stone. Who were they? A family member? A friend? Emma decided to start with Eleanor's life. If she could understand who Eleanor was, maybe the pieces would begin to fit. She accessed the town's digital archives, diving into records, old newspapers, and even genealogy databases. Slowly, a picture began to form. Eleanor Williams was only 21 when she died in 1989. She had been a promising student, active in local church groups and well-loved in her community. But her life had not been easy. Emma found old neighborhood newsletters that described the challenges Eleanor faced as a young, unmarried black mother. A local pastor had written vaguely about Eleanor's strength in the face of adversity, and her commitment to raising her child. Though no mention of the baby's name or fate was made, her heart sank when she stumbled upon a court record from 1988. Eleanor Williams versus the state of Maryland. The case had been dismissed, but the brief summary noted that Eleanor had been fighting to keep custody of her infant son against allegations of unfit parenting. Unfit? Emma thought bitterly. That was often code for something far more insidious. Digging further, Emma discovered a connection she hadn't expected. During the late 1980s, a social program in Maryland had come under scrutiny for targeting young, unmarried mothers from minority communities. Officially, the program aimed to provide opportunities for disadvantaged children, but it had been accused of forcibly removing babies from their mothers under the guise of adoption. Eleanor's fight suddenly made more sense. Emma needed more. She decided to visit the neighborhood where Eleanor had lived. It was a small, tight-knit community on the outskirts of town, dotted with modest homes and overgrown lawns. Emma parked near a small convenience store, hoping someone might remember Eleanor. The first few residents she approached were wary, their faces guarded when she mentioned the name. But finally, an older woman, Miss Bernice Holloway, paused mid-step when Emma asked, "Eleanor Williams?" The woman echoed, her brow furrowing. "Oh, I remember her. Sweet girl. Determined, too. Why are you asking about her now?" Emma hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm trying to learn about her life. Something doesn't sit right about how she passed." Ms. Holloway studied Emma for a long moment before sighing. "Come inside. I'll tell you what I know." The woman's living room smelled of lavender and fresh coffee. Ms. Holloway settled into her armchair, hands resting on her lap. "Eleanor was a fighter," she began. "She didn't have much, but she loved that baby of hers. Sighed he was her whole world." "What happened to her?" Emma asked gently. Ms. Holloway's face darkened. "They said it was an accident. She fell down some stairs. But I never believed that. She was healthy, careful, and right before she passed, she'd been saying someone was watching her, following her." Emma's stomach turned. "Do you know who?" "Ms." Holloway shook her head. "No, but I do know this. Eleanor didn't trust the people from that adoption program. She said they came around more than once, asking questions, trying to get her to sign papers. She told them no, of course, but..." The older woman trailed off, her expression heavy with regret. "After she died, they said the baby was taken into care, but no one ever saw him again." Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. Was the baby left on Eleanor's grave the same child she'd fought so hard to protect? If so, who had kept him all these years? "Do the initials Dio mean anything to you?" Emma asked, showing her the picture of the headstone. Ms. Holloway squinted at the image, then nodded slowly. "David Wilkes. He was her brother. Moved away a long time ago, but he loved her something fierce. If anyone knows what really happened to Eleanor, it'd be him." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The baby stirred in the bassinet beside her, as though sensing her unease. She'd uncovered pieces of Eleanor's story, enough to glimpse the horrors she faced. But it wasn't enough. She had to know more. The initials, the adoption system, the grave. It all connected, but the picture was still incomplete. Tomorrow, Emma decided she would find David Wilkes. The following morning, Emma stared at the address she had found in the archives for David Wilkes. It was in a town 2 hours away, a small rural place nestled between rolling hills. She hesitated briefly. What would she even say to him? But the thought of Eleanor's unresolved story and the baby's future pushed her forward. Emma loaded the baby into the car, securing the carrier in the back seat. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the barren winter trees blurring into gray shadows on either side. David Wilkes' house was modest, a single-story home with faded blue siding and a porch that creaked underfoot. Emma knocked twice, the sound echoing in the stillness. A man in his late 50s answered, his face lined with age and something deeper pain, perhaps. He looked at Emma with a mix of curiosity and caution. "David Wilkes?" Emma asked. "Yes. My name is Emma," she began. I'm looking into Eleanor Williams's life, your sister's life." At the mention of Eleanor, David's expression hardened. He stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. "Why?" Emma hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I found a baby on her grave." David's eyes widened briefly, but he masked his surprise with a stoic front. "You'd better come in." Inside, the living room was tidy but sparse. David sat across from Emma, his hands clasped tightly as she recounted the events of the past few days. When she finished, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice heavy. "It's worse than you think." David explained how Eleanor had been harassed by representatives of a state-funded adoption program that targeted single mothers in minority communities. "They called it help, but all they did was destroy families," he said bitterly. He went on to describe how Eleanor had refused to surrender her baby, even after repeated visits. "She was fearless," David said, his voice softening. "But fearless doesn't mean invincible." When asked about her death, David's hands clenched into fists. "They said it was an accident. I never believed that." He paused, his gaze falling to the floor. "I think they killed her to take the baby. And if they did, they'll come for anyone who tries to uncover the truth." Emma felt a shiver run through her. "Why didn't you do anything?" David's voice broke. "I tried, but they had power connections. Every time I asked questions, I got warnings. My family was threatened." He looked up at Emma, his eyes filled with both guilt and determination. "But if that baby is still alive, it's not over. We can still fight." That night, Emma returned home, her thoughts racing. The baby slept soundly beside her, but the weight of the day hung heavily over her. She reached for the blanket that had been wrapped around the child, her fingers brushing against the fabric. Something crinkled beneath her touch. A note. Emma unfolded the small, yellowed piece of paper, her breath catching as she read the scrawled handwriting. "Forgive me. I had no choice. The address will explain everything." The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Emma pulled up the image of Eleanor's headstone, comparing the handwriting on the note to the faint initials engraved on the stone. It was a match. Her heart raced as she realized what this meant. Eleanor, or someone close to her, had written this note. Someone had left it with the baby, intending for it to be found. Before Emma could fully process the implications, the faint sound of tires crunching gravel outside caught her attention. She moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. A dark sedan was parked across the street. Its headlights were off, but she could see the faint outline of someone sitting in the driver's seat, watching. Emma's chest tightened. Whoever they weren't here by accident. The dark sedan was still parked across the street the next morning. Emma peeked through the blinds as she cradled the baby in one arm, her free hand gripping her phone tightly. She had barely slept, her thoughts clouded by the ominous presence outside and the weight of what David Wilkes had told her. She knew she couldn't wait for answers to come to her. If someone was watching, they likely knew what she was investigating, and they didn't want her to get too far. Emma dialed a number she had found late the previous night. After hours of searching online, the contact information for a retired journalist, Lisa Carter, who had written about the forced adoption program decades ago. If anyone could confirm what David had said, it was her. Lisa lived in a small, cluttered apartment filled with stacks of yellowing newspapers and books. She welcomed Emma hesitantly, her sharp eyes scanning the baby with a flicker of recognition. "I don't know how much I can help," Lisa said as she poured tea. "But if you've found something, I'll listen." Emma wasted no time recounting the events, the grave, the baby, the initials, and David Wilkes' story. Lisa listened in silence, nodding occasionally but saying little. When Emma finished, Lisa leaned back, her expression grave. "What you're describing isn't new," Lisa said. "That adoption program, officially called the Family Placement Initiative, was a disaster. They targeted single mothers, especially Black and minority women, under the guise of giving their children better opportunities. In reality, it was about erasing their identities and assimilating those children into white middle-class families. Lisa pulled out a faded folder from one of her bookshelves. Inside were photocopies of old records, testimonies, and photographs. She placed a black and white photo on the table, showing a group of young women standing outside a courthouse, holding signs that read, "Our children are not for sale." Emma's stomach turned. "Eleanor?" she asked, pointing to a woman on the far left of the photo. Lisa nodded. She was part of the resistance. A group of mothers fought back, trying to expose what was happening. But they didn't get far. Most of their cases were dismissed. And the program quietly dissolved in the early 1990s after the damage had already been done. Emma leaned closer to the photo. The woman beside Eleanor looked familiar older, but unmistakably similar to someone Emma had met recently. "Is this Bernice Holloway?" Emma asked, recognizing the elderly woman who had spoken fondly of Eleanor. Lisa tilted her head. "It is. She was one of the leaders of the movement." "Why?" Emma's pulse quickened. "She told me Eleanor was being followed before she died. She believed the program had something to do with it." Lisa sighed. "I wouldn't be surprised. When the program couldn't get what it wanted, they didn't hesitate to silence people. Threats, harassment, even mysterious accidents. It wasn't uncommon." After leaving Lisa's apartment, Emma felt both clarity and dread. Eleanor had been part of something much bigger than herself, a fight against a system designed to exploit and erase women like her. But there was still the question of the baby. The note she had found haunted her thoughts. "Forgive me. I had no choice." The address will explain everything. What had Eleanor or whoever wrote it been trying to reveal? The address led Emma to a rundown building on the outskirts of town, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. It had once been an office, according to the faded sign above the door. Family Placement Initiative Headquarters. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust covered the floors, and papers were strewn across the desks as if someone had left in a hurry. Emma took careful steps, her flashlight cutting through the dimness. In the corner of the room, she found a filing cabinet toppled on its side, its drawers jammed shut. She crouched down, prying one open with her keys. Inside were files marked with case numbers and dates, some going back decades. Emma pulled out a folder labeled E. Williams, -1988. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages. It detailed Eleanor's refusal to relinquish her baby, repeated attempts to coerce her, and finally, an entry dated mere days before her death. Subject continues to resist. Recommend removal through external intervention. Her blood ran cold. External intervention? Was this proof they had orchestrated Eleanor's death? As she sifted through the rest of the folder, Emma found another document, a birth certificate for a boy, marked "Adopted" in bold red ink. But the name of the adopting family was blacked out. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hall outside. Emma froze, her heart pounding. She quickly gathered the files, stuffing them into her bag, and turned off her flashlight. Peering around the corner, she saw a shadow moving against the cracked wall. Someone was inside the building. Her mind raced. Whoever it was, they weren't here by accident. Emma clutched the baby's blanket in her bag, her fingers trembling as she backed toward the exit. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Emma burst into the sunlight, gasping for air as she ran toward her car. She didn't look back, not until she was inside and the doors were locked. The sedan was gone, but she knew it wouldn't be for long. Clutching the bag tightly, Emma started the engine and sped away. She had the evidence now enough to prove that Eleanor's death wasn't an accident and that the adoption program had been behind it. But she also knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer safe. The drive back to her apartment was a blur. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the sedan to reappear. Her mind raced, replaying the scene at the abandoned office, the file she had taken, and the shadowed figure stalking the halls. The baby stirred softly in the carrier beside her, a faint reminder of the fragile life now in her care. By the time she reached home, the adrenaline had ebbed, leaving behind a gnawing unease. Emma quickly secured the baby and the files, then triple-checked the locks on her doors and windows. She had always felt safe in her small apartment, but now every creak of the floorboards and distant car engine set her nerves on edge. That night, Emma spread the files across her kitchen table, a laptop open to cross-reference anything she found. The documents painted a horrifying picture of how deeply the forced adoption program had infiltrated lives. The most chilling detail was the systematic way it had targeted women like Eleanor's single mothers, often with little legal or financial recourse. The program had used fear, manipulation, and in some cases, outright force to separate families. But one name stood out repeatedly in the files: Alan Myers. Myers had been listed as the program's regional director and was mentioned in multiple reports about Eleanor's case. According to the files, he had personally approved the external intervention in her situation. Emma's stomach churned as she stared at his name. She typed it into her laptop's search bar, and a flurry of articles and public records appeared. Myers had left the adoption program in the early 1990s, but his influence hadn't waned. Today, he was a wealthy real estate developer, known for his philanthropy and connections to powerful figures in the city. If anyone was protecting the secrets of the program, it was him. The baby let out a soft cry, pulling Emma from her thoughts. She scooped the child into her arms, murmuring soothing words as she rocked back and forth. "You are the key to all of this," she whispered, looking down at the baby's peaceful face. "They wanted to hide you, but I won't let them." Just as she was settling the baby back into the bassinet, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Emma froze. The knock came again, harder this time. She approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding. "Emma?" A familiar voice called out. Relief washed over her as she recognized it. She opened the door to see her coworker, Jason, standing there with an apologetic smile. "Jason," she said, exhaling sharply, "what are you doing here?" "I heard you've been looking into Eleanor Williams," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Word travels fast in our circles. I figured I'd check in and see if you're okay." Emma frowned. "How do you know about Eleanor?" Jason hesitated, his eyes flicking to the files spread across the kitchen table. "I've worked on similar cases before. But Emma, you should be careful. These things don't always end well." There was something in his tone, something guarded, that made Emma's unease return. She studied his face, searching for signs of insincerity. "How do you know so much about this program?" she asked, crossing her arms. Jason shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I've been involved in local historical preservation for years. You'd be surprised what you learn when you dig deep enough." But Emma wasn't convinced. His presence felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. "Why are you really here, Jason?" she pressed. His expression darkened, and for a moment, the friendly facade slipped. "To warn you, you're digging into something dangerous. If you keep going, you could get hurt or worse." Emma's blood ran cold. "Is that a threat?" Jason shook his head quickly, his tone softening. "No, it's a fact. There are people who don't want this story to come out, Emma, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep it buried." With that, he turned and left, leaving Emma standing by the door, her mind reeling. The files, the note, the baby, and now Jason's warning. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that Emma couldn't yet fit together. But one thing was clear. Someone close to her knew more than they were letting on. As she locked the door behind her, she resolved to keep going. If they wanted her to stop, it only meant she was getting closer to the truth. Emma sat in her apartment, her eyes fixed on the files spread before her. The weight of the documents, the birth certificate with the blacked-out name, the chilling phrase external intervention, and the growing list of powerful figures implicated pressed down on her like a physical burden. She couldn't stay silent anymore. If the authorities wouldn't listen, if the people closest to her couldn't be trusted, there was only one avenue left: the public. Emma picked up her phone and dialed the number for the Chronicle, the city's largest newspaper. After explaining what she had, the urgency in her voice must have been convincing because within hours, she was sitting in the newsroom across from investigative journalist Rachel Miller. Rachel was sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, the type of person who looked like she could dismantle a conspiracy before breakfast. As Emma laid out the evidence, Rachel's pen flew across her notepad. "This isn't just a story," Rachel said when Emma finished. "This is a bombshell. If what you're saying is true, this could expose decades of systemic abuse and the people behind it." Emma nodded. "But it's not just about the past. Someone is still out there, trying to bury this. I've been followed. I've been warned. They're not going to stop." Rachel leaned back in a chair, her expression unreadable. "That's all the more reason to act fast. But you need to know, once we go public, there's no turning back. You'll be a target." Emma glanced at the baby, who was asleep in the carrier by her side. "I don't care what happens to me. But this story, it's Eleanor's justice. It's this baby's future. It needs to be told." Over the next 2 days, Emma worked with Rachel and her team to prepare the story. They verified the documents Emma had found, tracked down other women affected by the program, and pieced together a damning timeline of events. One survivor, a woman named Linda Parker, shared her heartbreaking testimony. "They came to my house," Linda said in a trembling voice. "Told me I was too poor to raise my daughter, that she'd be better off with a real family. They didn't give me a choice. They just took her." Hers was one of many voices, each more devastating than the last. By the time the article was ready, Emma felt the enormity of what they were about to unleash. The story broke on a Sunday morning. Rachel's headline read, "The Hidden Scars of Forced Adoptions, Exposing Decades of Injustice." Within hours, the piece went viral. Social media exploded with outrage as readers shared the story, demanding accountability. Other survivors came forward, emboldened by the article, their voices adding fuel to the growing fire. Emma watched from her living room as news anchors discussed the revelations on primetime television. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, some from supporters, others from unknown numbers she was too afraid to answer. But not all the reactions were positive. On Monday evening, as Emma returned home from a grocery run, she noticed her front door was ajar. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her eyes darting around the apartment. The place was in shambles. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered, and the baby's bassinet had been overturned. Panic surged through her as she searched the apartment. But the baby, thankfully, was safe with a trusted neighbor. Emma's stomach churned. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were sending a message. She called Rachel immediately. "They know," Emma said, her voice shaking. "They came into my home." Rachel didn't hesitate. "Pack a bag. You're staying with me tonight. We'll figure this out." That night, as Emma sat on Rachel's couch, her fear began to harden into resolve. The backlash was proof that the story was hitting its mark. The people responsible for Eleanor's death, for the countless families torn apart, were afraid, and that meant she was closer than ever to exposing the full truth. But Emma also knew the danger was far from over. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stay out of this. You've been warned." Emma stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. She refused to back down now. The fight for Eleanor's justice and the baby's future was just beginning. The days after the article broke were a whirlwind. Emma barely had time to breathe as the story dominated headlines across the nation. Survivors of the forced adoption program were coming forward in droves, sharing their harrowing experiences. Some recounted how their children were taken under false pretenses, while others revealed they had been coerced into signing adoption papers they didn't understand. The backlash was swift and fierce. Protests erupted outside city halls, with signs reading, "Justice for the mothers," and "Our families deserve answers." A flood of emails and calls overwhelmed the state's Department of Social Services, demanding accountability for the program that had quietly destroyed so many lives. But for Emma, the fight was far from over. Emma and Rachel met with a legal team to prepare a formal case against Alan Myers and the remnants of the Family Placement Initiative. The evidence Emma had collected was pivotal, and with the growing number of testimonies from survivors, it became clear that this was not an isolated issue, it was a systemic abuse of power. The baby, however, remained at the center of it all. Emma hadn't stopped wondering, why had the child been left on Eleanor's grave after so many years? And who had written the note asking for forgiveness? One evening, while sifting through the files yet again, Emma noticed something she hadn't before. A faint watermark on the birth certificate, the symbol of a private adoption agency connected to the program. The agency had gone out of business years ago, but a quick search revealed its founder was still alive. Harold Chambers, an 80-year-old man living in a quiet suburb not far away. Emma wasted no time arranging a meeting. When she arrived at his home, Chambers greeted her with suspicion, his frail hands trembling as he opened the door. "I don't do interviews," he muttered, trying to close the door. Emma wedged her foot in the gap. "This isn't about an interview. It's about Eleanor Williams." The name stopped him cold. Slowly, he stepped aside, allowing her in. Chambers' living room was as worn as he was, filled with faded furniture and old photos. He sank into a chair, his shoulders hunched as Emma explained why she was there. "I have no connection to that anymore," he said finally. "But you did," Emma pressed. "You approved adoptions through the Family Placement Initiative. You signed off on children being taken from their mothers." Chambers' face darkened. "I followed orders. We all did. Who left the baby on Eleanor's grave?" At that, Chambers' eyes flickered with something, a brief but unmistakable flash of guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said gruffly. Emma leaned forward. "Please, that child deserves the truth. Eleanor deserves the truth." For a long moment, Chambers said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he stood and shuffled toward a bookshelf. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook and handed it to Emma. "I kept this," he said quietly. "It's all I have left, but I don't know if it'll help you." Emma opened the notebook and found a list of names, women, dates, and case numbers. Eleanor's name was there, along with the initials DW. But what caught Emma's attention was a note scribbled in the margin beside Eleanor's entry. "Child sent to family. Recovered by DW." The truth hit Emma like a freight train. David Wilkes. Eleanor's brother hadn't just known about the program. He had taken the baby to protect him. Emma drove straight to David's house, her heart racing. He met her at the door, surprised to see her again so soon. "You lied to me," Emma said, holding up the notebook. David's face fell, and he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "I didn't lie," he said softly. "I just didn't tell you everything." He sat heavily on the couch, his hands clasped together. "When Eleanor died, I knew it wasn't an accident. I knew they'd come for her baby, just like they did for so many others. So I took him. I hid him." Emma's breath caught. "You raised him?" David nodded. "I tried to give him a normal life, but when he grew older, he wanted to know the truth. I told him about Eleanor, about how much she loved him, and then he disappeared, left to find answers on his own. I haven't seen him in years." Emma's mind reeled. "And the baby I found? Who left them on Eleanor's grave?" David's voice cracked. "I don't know, but if he's out there, he might have come back. Maybe he's trying to finish what Eleanor started." The revelation left Emma shaken, but it gave her the clarity she needed to move forward. With the help of Rachel and the legal team, she presented the evidence to the state attorney general, who launched a formal investigation into the forced adoption program. Weeks later, Alan Myers was arrested on charges of conspiracy and human rights violations. His fall sent shockwaves through the political and social systems, forcing other figures connected to the program to come forward or face similar charges. For Emma, the victory was bittersweet. Eleanor's name was finally cleared, her fight recognized as heroic rather than defiant. Survivors of the program began receiving compensation, and a national task force was established to ensure such abuses would never happen again. As for the baby, Emma ensured they were placed in a safe and loving home. She stayed in contact, visiting often and sharing stories about Eleanor, the brave woman who had fought against impossible odds to protect her child. One day, as Emma sat beside Eleanor's grave, she placed a small bouquet of lily on the headstone. "You did it, Eleanor," she whispered. "They'll never forget you." The wind stirred gently, carrying her words into the stillness of the cemetery. And for the first time in months, Emma felt at peace.